Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast, or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. I know things sound a little bit different. I'm currently on the road, out and about on a research stay at the Weizenbaum Institute in Berlin. And so while I'm down here in Germany, I wanted to spotlight both the research that's being conducted down here, as well as try to get in touch with some digital campaigners. And I think this episode turned out to be quite a treat. My guest today is Juri Schnöller. He is the co-founder and managing director of a digital political communication firm called Cosmonauts and Kings. And it's quite interesting because digital political consultancy, I think, is in a pretty early stage in Germany relative to the US, where we have these big firms like Blue State Digital, all the guests we've had previously on the podcast. But Cosmonauts and Kings was founded in 2016, and they've been doing some work with the German government around promoting stay-at-home campaigns during the coronavirus, and also work in the 2021 federal and state elections. So this episode, we're going to cover all types of ground, such as what is the digital political consulting scene. We'll talk about digital partnerships and influencer campaigns in Germany, both in the context of coronavirus, but also the elections. We'll talk about encrypted messaging apps, which play a pretty crucial role here in Germany, as many Germans are privacy aware and skeptical of more public platforms like Facebook and Twitter. And we'll also get into the nuts and bolts around the electoral system here in Germany, because we know these political structures matter. And Juri has a great grasp on how these structures translate into various facets of digital campaigning. So all in all, really fascinating interview. I hope that y'all in Germany and the EU enjoy it, but I think also for you in the US, it will be nice to compare these two polities, because Germany is such a power player in the EU. So their elections really do matter, both at the national level, but also at the supranational EU level. If you want to find out more about Cosmonauts and Kings, there will be a link down in the episode description. And also, Juri has recently published a book entitled The Public Arena Playbook, which offers a framework for digital political communication. That's in German, but they're working on an English translation, so I'll try to keep the links updated in the episode description. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Juri Schnöller. Again, he is the co-founder and managing director of Cosmonauts and Kings. Juri, thanks for taking the time out. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
I'm really excited as well to get to talk to you, because we've previously had some academics on the show that were discussing digital campaigning in Germany, but no practitioners yet working in digital campaigning. So why don't we start out by introducing our listeners to Cosmonauts and Kings? What's your mission here, and what type of work does the agency do?
Well, our mission is to lead democracy into the digital age. And how do we do that? By empowering civic actors to use digital communication in the way that is possible for them to reach their audience. That can be a political party, it can be a politician, a civil union, an interest group, but also, of course, think tanks, foundations, and NGOs. And we started 5 years ago, my co-founder and me. And our mission has led us now to more than 60 people. We are the market leader in Germany for digital political communication. We solely do digital stuff in the political world, and we're very excited for what's ahead of us.
Yeah, I'm curious to ask you precisely about this this role of digital kind of consulting services for digital political communication. It seems like it's a relatively new phenomenon to have these agencies. I mean, as you said, this company was started 5 years ago, and I suppose it's because parties traditionally kept their expertise kind of in-house. I mean, am I correct about that? Or can you describe what the digital political consulting scene is like here in Germany?
Well, it's a great question, because unlike the US, we have very small budgets in the political communication sphere in general. So, in total, you could say one of the leading parties has about a communication budget of 15 to 20 million euros for the entire campaign. So, unlike in the US, where billions and billions are spent down the ticket from smaller races up to the presidential ones, usually the scene here in Germany is not good for professional business expansion solely in politics, which I think is a good thing, to not have, all the private money flowing into politics trying to influence it. But this, of course, means that it was very difficult in Germany to develop a certain professional consultant world if there's no money. So what you had was traditionally marketing agencies and PR agencies doing from time to time political campaigns, but that was not their pure and sole business purpose. They usually do, traditional marketing campaigns, traditional PR consultancy for CEOs and executives. So we kind of pioneered that field together with a couple other small startups that you can see now since a couple of years. This younger generation of digital campaigners are slowly, kind of moving into the market and really occupying that with their own unique service point.
And how would you say that expertise is then built? I mean, I know you have some experience in the US and then moving into other campaigns in Germany, but I mean, do you find that in Germany that experience is being built on the fly? Is it behind the US in terms of expertise, or how do you kind of bring that culture to German political parties?
Well, you can see, of course, we in Germany all use the social media channels like in the US. So, of course, a lot of the perception of how content is spread, be it via Instagram stories, be it via Facebook Lives and others, is quite similar. But of course, we have a different political system and a different political culture. It's not a bipartisan system, as you know, multi-partisan, meaning all the parties have to compromise much more on the issues they care about. They have to form a coalition, they have to manage to work together, but ultimately also the voting system, since we have not a winner-takes-it-all system, but a proportional vote combined with a winner-takes-it-all system. 50% of the parliament is voted by that, but the other 50% by proportional vote via lists in the respective states. And this all leads to the fact that, of course, a campaigner in Germany needs a very specific skill set, because besides all the, let's say, digital or communication expertise, you need to really understand the political system, and you need to know how this works out. Because I actually work a lot often and consult with American consultants, and they're often, let's say, confused how difficult and confusing sometimes, of course, German politics can be.
Definitely. Well, I'm very glad you're picking up on these systemic issues. This speaks to my political scientist heart. And I have some questions about this as we move along. But you've recently written a book entitled The Public Arena Playbook. And there's a link to it down in the episode description in German. And it offers a framework for digital political communication. You write that the framework in the book is applicable to various types of political actors, local politicians, members of parliament, NGOs, ministries, etc. Can you tell us about that framework? And more specifically, what role does social media play within it? Kind of in your view, is social media more valuable to certain types of political actors compared to others?
Yeah, no, I mean, when you look at the campaigning community, and we're a small crowd, we probably could all fit into a pub, the people who really deeply care about, let's say, political campaigning and deeper digital campaigning. The big problem is we always focus on the tip of the iceberg, what I call it. It's the 1% of the races that have the budget, that have the knowledge, that have the people, that have the data experience, and so on and so on. But 99% of the races in Western democracies are run on the local and regional level, where people usually lack knowledge, they lack budgets, they lack resources, and they lack people how to execute a campaign. So my vision was to formulate and build a book where people can apply the knowledge that we do on a daily basis, but use it for their own purposes, maybe if they don't have the resources. And the great news is there's so many tools today out there. I mean, you don't need an agency to build up a nice landing page. There's so many click, drag and drop tools that you can basically, if you have the knowledge, from the scratch, build a campaign by your own. So that was my vision. Of course, hopefully we'll be able to distribute it in English soon as well. So the English listeners will be able to enjoy it. But yeah, that was for us the understanding. The so-called public arena is changing. And if you as a professional communicator in the digital world, in the digital era, need to know the tools, the mindset, and also the framework, which is consisting of various components of a good, well-run, executed campaign in order to do that. But you don't need to hire an agency, you don't need to hire expensive consultants. You can do it on your own.
Right, and you've also, in a sense, helped in democratizing that access with this tool, Civical, that you're a co-founder of. It's a social media management software for politics. And I was just looking at the website that it was used by over 250 candidates in the Bundestag election, as well as other actors that we've been discussing, NGOs, parties, et cetera. And could you tell us about this Civical in terms of how it works and how it's been used by various German political actors?
Exactly. I mean, when we started Cosmonauts and Kings, we realized over the years that, one of the big issues is, as always, a traditional service agency player, you can always service people up to a specific, let's say, resource availability. So a lot of local candidates would come to us who say, like here, I have 500 euros, what can I do with it? How can I reach my people in my little hometown? I want to become mayor. And we said, here, you got to do this, but sorry, we cannot really help you because it's just not fitting in our business model and you can't just simply do it on an economic purpose. So we decided to create a tool that gives people the availability to reach people via a very simplified version of targeting purposes. So we kind of used an interface and built up a very nice UX to simplify the Facebook and Instagram targeting manager, but also connected with political target groups. Because usually in 99% again of the races, people don't A/B test 200 target groups down the line, what we always hear about the fancy data-driven campaigns, but they just say, look, I want to reach people who are interested in economic policies. I want to reach young and first-time voters. So, it's very repetitive in terms of retargeting those people. Mm-hmm. And this is what we try to build with that software and to solely use it for people that use social media for political outreach. And it turned out to be very effective. We're right now in a financing round looking for VC investors to make it much broader applicable across Europe.
Very cool. Very cool. I wonder, there should be some type of political Shark Tank to duke these things out. But I'm curious because Cosmonauts and Kings describes itself as data-driven. And I wonder how that works with two aspects of the German context. The first is legal, where Germany has pretty strict national level laws around data and privacy. And it's also under the EU umbrella of GDPR, Digital Services Act, et cetera. And then the second is more cultural, with Germans being extremely careful about data privacy. So how does that impact your work, particularly around this social media targeting?
Yeah, no, I think that's actually an asset. Back in the past, people always said, in Germany, it's so difficult with data privacy. But as you could see, if you look at the US and what we're having right now with Facebook and the overall question of, let's say, data privacy, then I think it's a good asset to say we come from the country with the strongest and hardest data privacy laws in the world, which of course doesn't make business necessarily easier, but you just have to be smarter. I mean, there's a lot of publicly available data that you can use and use it more on a broader sense, not to individual target voters, but to get an understanding. So what we say when we say data-driven means making your decision-making process more data-driven, making data more accessible to the people within the organization, because often people have a lot of data on their party members, on their preferences people have, but they don't really use this in the day-to-day decision-making process. So when we talk about that, we don't necessarily mean, this type of micro-targeting that people often talk about, which I think in terms of ethics also needs to be applied to the highest and most strict standards. And I think it's good that we're having this conversation and Facebook is held accountable to what's being shared and spread across the platform. But it's much more about an internal understanding of how do I as an organization become more data-driven and how does data help me in a day-to-day decision-making process.
That's interesting. So it seems like you're arguing even in a restricted legal regime around privacy, you can use targeting in ways that feed data into your organization. So sort of like crowdsourcing from the voter.
Yeah, no, I mean, like I personally, as you know, from the academic side, there's a lot of still discussion. If I put, let's say, $1,000 into Facebook, how many voters does it get me, right? This is still like the correlation between these two lines and where are the persuasion levels across this is still up to debate. But what we can say is that, for instance, when we worked for the German government in the COVID crisis, that you could see it helps a lot, for instance, visualizing and knowing, look, in East Germany, there's a lot of people who are very skeptical of vaccination. And this is extremely the case maybe between people above 60. And you can do that by just traditional surveys. And then you get this data by people and their policy preferences, and you develop content according to that. It sounds very simple, and to be honest, there's not much secret sauce to it. But doing that on a day-to-day basis already takes a lot of discipline within the organization. It takes a lot of discipline from the communication department, and most importantly, from the politicians or policymakers who communicate that issues.
Yeah, and I mean, in full transparency, I don't know too much about German political parties, but they seem to be pretty well-oiled machines, and especially the old ones, right? I mean, there's this, going out to the voters in the streets. They have these press secretaries, and they have lots of experience doing that. And I wonder, when thinking about political campaigning, for example, can bringing in an external consultant kind of provide something extra, because that coordination is like bringing that expertise on board, right? I wonder, when you're thinking about, as you're saying, like connecting real-world polling to digital data, although the party machine is quite tight, it still takes a lot of internal organization. And I wonder whether digital consultants are kind of like greasing the wheels of that machine a bit.
Right. I mean, the question is exactly what kind of expertise are you requesting? I mean, I've seen many cases where, for instance, just being a consultant or the traditional understanding of consultancy doesn't really get you far into the organization, because, as you said, it's a closed organization with people being in charge of stuff. So what we always try to do is working much more embedded, similar to a situation room, or basically being a hired performance marketer that comes in and constantly works within the organization and is completely embedded into the work structures, into the work streams, into the Slack channels. Because otherwise this traditional understanding of here's the party, here's the agency in our fast-paced communication and news cycles don't really work anymore. But one thing to the party structures, I think both traditional parties, the CDU and SPD, CDU now much more, with of course going into opposition, will have to completely transform their decision-making bodies and also their structure, because they might be a professional, well-oiled machine, as you said, but the member rates of the parties themselves is pretty old, much older than the average population. I think CDU is about 58 or 60, whereas the average population is 48. So you have this gap. And still a lot of people don't access social media on a day-to-day basis. So the question is, how do you bridge the gap between reaching your party members and the actual voters, where often this is a kind of clash in terms of communication culture?
Yeah, definitely. And I think maybe to give a concrete example of what I was thinking is, like, let's say something like post approval just to get a post on Facebook. I mean, I've heard a little bit about different digital outreach initiatives from German parties that a lot of times they're not responsive because there's so many steps of approval and going back and forth. And I think that's maybe where, if you bring in someone who says, okay, we're taking charge of the digital messaging or something, that it would be more responsive in this very dynamic political space where, in the US you would fundraise off of an event, but I'm sure in Germany you can still message based on what happened this morning, for example.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, for instance, the Green did a very interesting approach this election cycle. They took a lot of people who used to work for the Greens and basically built a kind of in-house agency. And I think this style is changing because, honestly, I mean, we see it as well when we work in elections. We are not capable of working in this traditional agency cycle where you have creative ideas and then it goes into the cycle and the loop. I mean, you need to be able to create ideas and execute the content within a matter of minutes or hours. So I think we're coming to a point where in political campaigning we need more hybrid structures where it's not that much difference anymore if you're hired by the party or if you're an external consultant, but you need to have the communication streams ready. You need to have the FREMA or signal groups ready where the politician is in and you just post the stuff and say, please approve, and maybe the chief of staff says, yes, go, go, go. No, we need to change that, but this needs to happen fast and not email, BCC 20 people, and then the discussion starts.
Interesting that you bring up Signal, which I wanted to ask you about these encrypted apps, because one thing I've noticed being in Germany is that, trying to get in touch with people, Facebook Messenger, forget it. Everyone is on Signal, WhatsApp, Telegram, and I don't use these apps normally, but I was looking around on Telegram to get in touch with people that I know here. And I saw, for example, that there was a group for the CDU Berlin, a public channel, and they were kind of seeding pro-CDU infographics. But it only has around 700 members here in the Berlin chapter. And I'm wondering what role these encrypted apps play in German campaigns. Are they more of these internal canvassing frameworks, or are they also being used as outreach tools for citizens that are maybe not on more public social media?
Yeah, no, I mean, what you say is definitely the first. We see a huge fragmentation, especially COVID has led to the people flooding into private messaging and using much more these private groups than before, and using it as a source of information. I mean, we had a big debate in Germany, as you know, with the vaccination rates. We're one of the lowest in Europe. And of course, the infrastructure of right-wing conspiracy theorists and others using Telegram very successfully to spread out not just criticism, but constantly spreading doubts about, let's say, the intentions of the government, intentions of the vaccination efforts proved to be very successful. And I recall, because when we worked back in the days in the Ministry of Health and the minister decided to open up a Telegram channel, it was criticized at the beginning, but it had over the course of the pandemic nearly 500,000 subscribers, was by far the largest channel in terms of a governmental institution. And it just shows you that people are moving away from, as you said, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. But it makes it much more challenging for people like us, campaigners, because you don't know how far a certain message is spreading. So when we're talking about rapid response, when we're talking about counter speech, it's much easier to say, oh, look, my tweet got 500 negative replies, I gotta get a message out. You don't know how often the video is shared in various Telegram channels. That's just not to comprehend. So you have to observe these channels, you have to be aware what are the conversations about. And this makes it additionally difficult for political parties because it's much more fragmented, and it makes it much harder for analytics software to comprehend what the conversations are about.
Yeah, and I guess because of this encrypted notion, it is difficult to build something on top to try to estimate.
I mean, just one example though, the Social Democrats, for instance, they did it very successfully in getting, having a Telegram channel up and running for the party members, and really providing them as a source of content provision where they then can use to distribute it amongst the local channels. So I think it's much more effective to use it for party mobilization efforts and really just spreading quickly content there and having a direct interaction possibility. I mean, you can have voting possibilities, you can have surveys whatsoever. Then reaching, let's say, new potential voters, I think is much more difficult over these channels.
Yeah, previously on the podcast, we covered some examples of Grunlinks in the Netherlands doing that at the local level using WhatsApp. But it was interesting because they were, in a sense, pushed to it because it was free. They didn't need to design an app. They could use these groups. And it seems like that it's probably not so much of a cost decision for the SPD, but it seems to be working.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we're right now, as you can see, we're at the beginning of the so-called messengerization of political communication in Germany. A famous political consultant in Germany, Martin Fuchs, he also wrote about it. I mean, I fully agree that at the end of the day, what we're seeing right now is just this beginning of fragmentation. And as a politician, a modern 21st century politician, you really have to think about at the beginning of your career and your positioning strategy. Which channels do I use professionally? Because you cannot simply, manage everything. You cannot be on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Telegram, whatsoever, running a blog. I mean, you just don't have the capacity. So you have to understand your audience, your constituency. Are you coming from a rural constituency, from a, let's say, urban constituency? How does the social demographic look like? And what kind of channels are people using? And then build your strategy around that, and not the other way around, because often enough I talk, when I go into workshops with politicians, they say, Juri, I don't know, I have 10 channels and my people are tired and fat and tired because they do nothing else, they do no policy work because they have to put stuff on the channels all the time. So I think this becomes a much even more crucial question in the years to come.
Yeah, I was going to say also, because you also have to think about policy. But let's keep on the topic of these latest German elections in 2021, which was a super year as federal and state elections coincided. Coming out of that, we've been talking about messaging platforms. Were there any sort of breakout platforms in your view or innovations prior to relative cycles?
Well, what we definitely saw again was the growing importance of Telegram or messengers, I would say, but even furthermore, also TikTok played an increasingly significant role, especially, of course, with first and young-time voters, with mobilization of the climate movement, such as Fridays for Futures and others. I mean, they were very prominent on that platform. But on a third layer, it was not so much even the platforms themselves, but we saw a growing influence of so-called influencer political marketing. So a lot of, let's say, people who were not traditionally affiliated with a political party started to speak out, and parties used them on their behalf to, for instance, push certain environmental issues, push on their agenda. That was something that was much more used than it was 4 or 8 years ago.
That was my next question about digital partnerships. But great that you bring it up, because I'm curious. We had a podcast guest talking a little bit about the Biden campaign using these. And what's interesting about that conversation was the different tiers of influencers. Like we even had some kind of breakdown of like micro versus meso. But the idea was that even someone with a 10,000 Instagram following can be important, because there's focus around a niche issue. So I know that Cosmonauts and Kings assisted the Federal Ministry of Health in promoting this digital stay home campaign where influencers were a part of. But can you tell us a little bit about digital partnerships and influencers working either with COVID or also with campaigns?
Yeah. Here you see, the big difference to traditional, let's say, influencer marketing is that, of course, when you're reaching out to these influencers, no matter if they have 1 million followers or 10,000 followers, they have built a brand, they have built a vivid and living community. So of course, the, let's say, political or social issue you're reaching out to them with needs to be connected and aligned with the values they represent. So you cannot just go to, like a potential, a ski influencer and say, okay, please talk about how bad the migration policy of the European Union is. So of course, it starts with the issue you're trying to raise in the campaign, and then you identify certain, let's say, influences that might be of relevance. And then again, the second point is, do you find an agreement where you actually pay them, or does it, represent their values so much that, of course, they're doing it because they just simply believe in the cause? Like, for instance, what you said with the Ministry of Health. None of the influencers were paid, of course. Like, they all participated because they believed in the mission and, of course, the importance of the key message. And often, when we do, for instance, right now, a women's rights and anti-hate speech campaign against women, also all the women that participate, they don't get a single euro. So it differs in terms of traditional influencer marketing that people usually, I would say, don't get paid, but of course you need to give them something in return. Like, for instance, a politician is right next then maybe to the influencer, coming on their podcast, coming on their show, whatsoever. Like, there needs to be a certain trade-off that they also can, let's say, benefit from the cause. But overall, the mission and the significance becomes more important. And last point, because as you rightly said, it's not about the sheer size of the audience the influencers have, but much more about the particular community they're serving. If you're, for instance, trying to really reach, let's say, young and first-time voters, a young influencer who's maybe just talking about, financial ideas, investments for people just coming out of high school, and he has 8,000 followers, but they're all between 18 and 22, he might be a very relevant influencer if you're, for instance, a financial institution and really trying to create awareness about investment possibilities or whatsoever. So it's really, at the end, it comes down to the specific issue you're trying to raise, and really look out who are the best communities and the influencers who could amplify that message.
Yeah, I want to pick up on something you said, because it reminded me of that interview about influencers, and that we were talking about this idea of access. That, yeah, the influencers might not get paid, but they expect something in return. And a lot of times it's not so much about money. It might be about, exclusivity, like an invite to a club. This is what they're kind of used to in their world. So I wonder how, what types of access or what types of perks can you entice influencers to engage with?
Well, if you're reaching out to them, of course, it depends on what is your brand, what does your organization look like. It's usually much easier, for instance, if you're a politician, than a party to reach out to certain influencers, because political parties, no matter what, you affiliate and associate yourself maybe with a lot of other policy issues that you're not necessarily agreeing with. And traditionally, I would say center-right parties such as the CDU would have it much more difficult to reach out to those influencers or to respective ones, because unlike the Greens, they're not very popular between people below 30s. So at the end of the day, it comes down to the question, rightly, as you said, do you have to offer something in exclusivity that gives them, again, a good cause for their community, maybe an interactive session with a minister or a specific campaign. But we're right now just at the beginning of this so-called political influencer marketing increase, because people are losing trust in political parties. They are losing trust in traditional media. So in this fragmentation of media sphere, influencers with their voice and with their communities become increasingly important to spread a message, because they enjoy often, let's say, credibility numbers that political parties just simply don't have.
Very interesting. I have a lot of questions. We could keep going down this road, but I do want to get into some of the more structural aspects of the political system and the electoral system that you were opening with. And I'm well aware of the bias that Americans have of comparing everything to the U.S., but I mean, there are some interesting similarities and differences between Germany and the U.S. And one of those similarities is that both countries have a federal system where power is shared between federal and state governments. And, if you're in a state level election, you can kind of decide, I think, whether you're going to focus on local issues or appeal to a more national level platform. So how do you see that dynamic playing out in Germany, especially since the 2021 elections involved races at both levels?
I would say it always depends if you're on the winning and the losing side. If I'm a consultant and the party is losing in a state election, I would always blame it on the federal level. I would say, it was not our fault. The feds basically messed it up. And if, of course, I win, I will say, look, despite the bad numbers and the federal trend, we managed to win and get out with our message. But overall, what you can see in Germany is that it's very hard in state elections to win out from an opposition perspective. We have the so-called Landesmutter or Landesvater bonus, which is called the state mother or father. Germans usually love this kind of prime minister that were called in Germany Ministerpräsident, which is like the governor compared to the US. And people kind of look up to them, and they have a very presidential style of governing, representing their state, being of course very proud of them. And they usually don't get involved that heavy in day-to-day state politics. So state elections usually are, of course, connected, since we're not as large as the US, to what's going on also in the federal debates. Right next year we have, for instance, North Rhine-Westphalia, largest state in Germany, 16 million people live there. It's hugely important for the CDU and for the SPD to win that state, because we also have a two-chamber political system, the Bundestag, but also the Bundesrat, where the states are represented, similar like the Senate and the House. So that means that, of course, every race in the states also directly impacts the federal government, because you need a majority, or at least a working majority, in both of the chambers. So state elections have in the past turned more and more into also voting on the, let's say, the favorability of the federal government who's in charge right now.
So there's this very, close interplay between pitting the two levels of government against each other or with each other, depending on how it benefits your personal message.
Yeah, no, and it's, of course, it's complicated because in the Bundesrat, because the representation is based by the government coalition, and right now it's very complicated if you compare it 30 years ago, since we have so many new coalition options, like what we're going to have around with the Ampel, and there is Jamaica, so-called, with the Greens, the Liberals, and the CDU. We have Greens and CDU, so there's, I don't need to get into it, but there's plenty of color options from coalitions, and usually they abstain from the vote if there's something they're not in the government with. And this makes it, again, for political campaigning much more difficult, because back in the days it was much clearer what the coalition options would look like, and today it's everyone can work with everyone, and we're becoming much more a Scandinavian type of democracy, where there is 3 or 4 blocks that are nearly similar, and the two Volksparteien are, at least in the long run, decreasing in terms of share of the vote, which makes it much more difficult to, for instance, run a highly polarized campaign, and then in the end you need to form a coalition again. So it becomes tricky in terms of communication style. Just one last example, because the CDU tried in the last 4 weeks of the election, Linksrutsch verhindern, which was basically claiming we need to warn Germany for the left government. So, but in the end of the day, 2 of these parties, the FDP and the Greens, would have need to form a coalition with the CDU anyway. So it was hardly credible to run an anti-left campaign if you later down the line would need to form a coalition with them anyways.
Yeah, that is super interesting because I wanted to ask you precisely about negative campaigning or digital attack ads because you think of these U.S. as the polarized two-party system, which is very good for those types of attacks. And I was going to ask about Germany as does the multi-party system and also the culture work against that digital campaigning? But I think maybe that's one aspect that you just brought up is that you can't totally attack an opponent that you may need to cooperate with later.
I love America. I love American politics when it comes about this positive notion of the shining city on the hill, the best days are yet to come, and so on and so on. I think since actually the Trump campaign and what has paved the way also with the Tea Party movement and others is I think also Americans always underestimate the decrease of attractivity for political parties around the world to kind of adopt what's going on in the US. I feel like we're at a stage where I want to say I don't want to have this political culture here in Germany where you see these negative ads and constantly throwing dirt at each other, calling always the other side, an enemy of democracy, an enemy of the people whatsoever. And this is one thing I can say in a positive regard. All the negative ads that were run in the German campaign from all sides, from the SPD, who tried to brand the chief of staff by the CDU candidate as an ultra-orthodox conservative, and on the other side, the CDU throwing constantly dirt at the Social Democrats, was widely criticized, not just in the media, but didn't get a lot of traction in the German public. So I would say people are not as favorable towards negative campaigns as maybe in the US. But of course, it's a growing trend that we also see, especially on social media. The discourse has become much more negative. It has become much more polarized. But so negative campaigns are still the exception and not the normal.
And would you say part of that reason is, you mentioned media criticism. I mean, do you think that's, in a sense, the media as a watchdog against too much negativity?
Yeah, as you know, we have a very, very strong publicly financed media structure. You can say what you want about, let's say, the GEZ-Gebühren, which is, of course, not highly popular among people. This is like the fee every German has to pay in order to finance that media infrastructure. But one thing they enable and still uphold is a broad communication infrastructure that is not biased or not, hunting for the next headline. And cable news and news anchors, like in the US, don't really play that significant role in terms of really mobilizing people for or against a specific agenda. But, however, of course, Germany, like all other Western democracies, has seen that this fragmentation of our media landscape has led to the way of new political movements, such as our right-wing party, the AfD, but also, as we can see right now with the vaccination efforts, actually still a comparatively high level of distrust towards government and towards, let's say, the effectiveness of government, which is still in the long run one of the key challenges for politicians and parties to figure out new ways how to reach out to voters and not lose that bond of trust, because populism is not that, and it might come back one day stronger than ever before.
And for the listeners, stay tuned, because the next episode will be all about that right-wing media ecosystem in Europe and in the US. But one last question for you here, which is about the general attitude that German politicians have towards digital campaigning. I mean, we've heard in previous episodes that some of the older politicians are kind of skeptical towards digital outreach. They prefer to be in the streets, which makes sense. But do you think that's changing? And is there a split between maybe digital pessimists and optimists between German politicians?
I think, to the last question, I think what we see right now is extremely positive. This new Bundestag, we have so many young MPs. There's over 150 MPs who are younger than 40 years old. And all of the parties have elected a lot of new, fresh faces, young people between their 20s and 30s. They come from a digital natives generation. They're completely communicating in a much more approachable way, similar like AOC in the US, using social media, being kind of normal, approachable people. And it's also starting to change the communication dynamics. So I think that's a positive sign, actually, to watch out for, and connected to, let's say, pessimists and optimists. At the end of the day, it's what we humans make out of it. I think, of course, technology is never good or bad, and same goes for our political system in terms of how can we improve that. And we definitely saw that with all the problems of disinformation, of platform regulation, of hate speech, of growing polarization, that again, the governmental bodies and parliament need to come up with legislation on a German but also on a European level to tackle that. So far, We have made it ourselves very easy to blame Facebook and the others say, oh, look how bad it is. But there were not really comprehensive proposals put out on the table by any political party to really say, this is the way forward, how we can ensure that this public arena of our democracy stays constructive, stays positive, and enables everyone articulate their free voice without, of course, discriminating other people or spreading fake news.
Well, Juri, this has been absolutely fascinating and a super interesting insight into the German political communication system in terms of social media and digital. So thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you, and stay healthy and safe.
I've just been speaking with Juri Schnöller, co-founder and managing director of Cosmonauts and Kings. To find out more about the firm, check out the links in the episode description. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next episode, we're going to be diving into the far-right alternative media sphere and how Republican legislators engage with those sources on Twitter. That'll be with Mike Calburn and Kurt Knopfer from the Freie Universität. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Berlin. See you next time.